Hey, my name is Dina Gusovsky. I was a writer and performer at Late Night with Seth Meyers for over 7 years. And before that, I was an investigative journalist, most recently at CNBC. And I also came to America from the former Soviet Union as a Soviet Jewish refugee. And I'm just thrilled to be talking to you, Jake. Jake is a writer, director, actor, what we in the biz call a multi-hyphenate. And not only did he direct this wonderful film, but he also co-wrote it. So I just want to dive right in. There's so many stories to mine from this material. What drew you to this one specifically?
There was a detail that I had come upon. The one-time use crematorium was something I didn't know anything about. And I wasn't looking to make a movie in Israel, certainly not a movie in Hebrew, but I was grabbed by this detail. And like, writers do as they're starting to think maybe there's some, gold under this, little patch of dirt. I dug a little deeper and it opened up into different perspectives about the country at the time, but also this idea of the country kind of coming to terms for the first time publicly with what had happened to the European Jews. As Israel in the 1960s, when you start to talk to people, there was a bit of a dam of shame about this subject matter in terms of talking about it publicly. And the Eichmann trial itself was really the first time that all these stories were heard at once. So that small detail built into something much larger. And then, of course, it became, how do we do this story in a sort of small scale, humanist way that tells individual stories and doesn't try to do everything?
Can you take us through sort of like the production aspect? I'm curious as to, from when you knew this was the story that you wanted to tell to when, we saw it on screen. How did that go? Because I think for folks who aren't in this industry, they don't realize just how much goes into all of that.
Yeah, before I really started writing anything at all, I had an idea, a more fictionalized version of what the story would be. And I went to Israel on a research trip where I had a researcher helping me find some of the living participants in the story. And we started to interview them. And I interviewed them on film, thinking that maybe at some point we would use that footage interspersed in the movie in a structure, like a movie like Reds or something, where you come back to people who kind of lived in the time and lived that experience. But I mean, ultimately that was not the direction we went in. But what it did was it deepened all of these ideas that I had in my head. And I realized there was a kind of cultural layer that I wouldn't be able to penetrate on my own when I realized, oh, we'd be telling a story that's much closer to these people's stories than something sort of more fictional that merges with this one historical sort of public fact, the Eichmann execution and everything else. And so I went, while I was there, I tried to find a writer to work with, and I very luckily found Tom Schwal, who's a great director and a great screenwriter, and asked him to make a script with me. And he agreed, and we became very close friends. And he's a wonderful person to work with. Now, through that process, he always felt very confident about me making this movie in Hebrew, which I never really intended to do, because I think I like to take each step, of the process sort of, it's really one step at a time thing. So first it was, can we get a script that feels, like it'll work? And we're writing in English and we're going back and forth. And toward the end, it felt like there was really no other way to do it and make it feel like it would have the authenticity that I think it needed to work. And so I had very supportive producers, and I went back to them. I said, I think we should be making this in Hebrew, and they supported it right away. And then we had to try to figure that out, how to do that from there, because my Hebrew's not so good.
And also that sort of brings me to like the casting process, right? Because then it probably became a different process of who you're looking to cast in this.
Yeah, funnily enough, my Hebrew reading is pretty good. So the only thing that didn't have to be translated would be the casting lists. I could sound out the names of the actors, one by one as we would do it. there's a casting director there in Hila Yuval, who had done a number of TV shows and movies. And what I had found, in particular, she'd done Shtisel, and I found that she had this incredible talent for group casting, that the chemistry within a group of actors worked so well consistently in the things that she did. So I really wanted to work with her, and the producers were able to get her. And it became a process, of, we have these talented people, sort of putting your trust in them to find you the things that you know you want and know that you need, and you'll know what that feels like when you see it, but very hard to do it in a place so far from the way you would normally work. And I found that consistently through the process with each person in every department, extremely supportive of, my sort of outsiderness.
Was it one of those things that when you saw the reads, you were like, okay, yeah? Or did you really rely on?
No, no, very much so. The process is not so much different. And, I think I'd said this before, where I think the movie watcher part of one as a director kind of takes over. As you see a lot of movies in other languages and things, and they function in the same way in terms of, quality control. If you're inserting yourself into that process, not good acting versus very good acting, I think, can be detected in any language. Also, the thing is, a script, as you're rehearsing it and going through this casting process, becomes a bit programmatic, just, insofar as you're hearing the same thing over and over again. So I co-wrote it. I know what the words are, even if I don't know all of the Hebrew words that are being said. But by getting to do it again and again, you become very familiar with what these things are. So that part of it doesn't change too much.
I wanted to talk about a scene in particular that really struck me, and that was the scene between Micah Aronson and Joy's character at the bar, and this conversation about, what's easier on the Jewish soul? Is it to move on, or to keep acknowledging that pain? And I felt I walked away from that asking myself that, because growing up, with a grandmother who's a Holocaust survivor and then coming from the Soviet Union, it's like a question that comes up all the time. And I wonder, for you, when you were writing it, did you sort of know where you fell into that sphere?
I think the scene, in many ways, is a sort of conversation between Tom and myself. It's a scene really without answers, but we know that the questions are so urgent and sort of important. And when you transpose it against the idea that we're really with the last of the survivors, in terms of being able to hear these stories firsthand, I think where it becomes something that's meaningful in making movies about this stuff is that it's a way of saying, how do we keep these things present? How do we make this subject matter itself contemporary in a way, just by talking about it? So no matter how you talk about it or how provocative it may or may not be, the fact that you're talking about it all really means something. And I think also, because I think some people start to think of, the so-called Holocaust film as a bit of a subgenre that they, see many, many times. The bigger note to that is how these stories have affected so many people, and generationally, how much that does. So of course the mandate becomes, we can't keep making the same kinds of movies again and again. You can't do it better in terms of the recreation of horrors than Schindler's List or Son of Saul or one of those movies. But there are lots of other ways to engage in the subject matter. And so Tom and I were very inspired by Claude Lanzmann, who's one of the great documentarians of all time. And he made this 10-hour documentary called Shoah. He set out to make a 1-hour documentary that would take 1 year to make. It's a 10-hour documentary that took 10 years to make. He's a real pioneer of cinema, and he came up with a sort of language where you rely on the testimony of these individuals. And you never cut to archival footage, and he uses no recreation. And that was something that Tom and I were really interested in trying to do in a narrative movie. Would there be a place to do it? And so in the scene that precedes the scene, in the bar with Mika and Ada, we hear his story of this experience in the ghetto, and trying to do that in a way where we're not recreating it, but we're filling in sort of our own ideas of what these things look like as he tells us his narrative. Um, so I don't think that scene between Mika and Ada has a resolution, to the subject matter itself, but I think it has a big resolution between these two people with big opposing views on the subject. And even though they don't necessarily come to some sort of agreement, they certainly are drawn closer to one another. And that was something I was very interested in trying to achieve, and I was very pleased with what we ended up with those wonderful actors.
Yeah, and even the scene where the group was trying to take a picture with him, like this is like their tourist thing. It reminded me so much. I lived in downtown Manhattan for many years, and it reminded me of tourists going to the 9/11 memorial with like their selfie sticks and smile. It didn't sit right, and I felt that that was so interesting that decades ago, and we really haven't evolved that much as a human race. Um, Speaking of which, this film was, and by the way, how long did it take from sort of conception to when it was released in 2022?
Oh, well, when it was released, several years. That's probably 3 or 4 years at that point. But from getting a script together and getting it going was, a little more than a year. We were able to kind of do that, and then it just, how do you do it and when? And it was delayed a couple of times, and so each of these movies always have a different sort of trip down the birth canal, I guess.
Yeah. And of course, we're, talking at a time when sort of the wounds of October 7th are so fresh and, anti Semitism is on the rise. And I wonder if you sort of reflected on that, especially, as somebody who is a storyteller of these kinds of stories. Like, we had the Holocaust. Is this going to be an ongoing thing when we talk about this generational trauma that, maybe we seem to be on the other side of it and then we almost got pulled back, it seems.
Yeah, I mean that's a hard one to answer in a larger way, outside of the movie itself. I think as it applies to the movie itself, I had made a documentary about Brian De Palma, who said a thing about, you make these movies, and they sort of meet the time that they're in. They're judged by, whether it's the social mores or the political environment, things of what's happening at the time. So, when we made it and when it is viewed, it can seem like there are all sorts of different intentions behind the movie, and I find that very fascinating. I love engaging in that sort of thing, and I like engaging with audiences about it. And I don't think I have the answers with that sort of stuff. And I think if I did have the answers about any of these kinds of things, I'd make a movie about it. It's important also to be thoughtful in these things. You can't in the same way you can't make a movie about everything. Trying to figure out a way that these works engage the world that they're being shown in is its own kind of mystery too. So the best thing with them is to just get to show them as much as possible, and allow people to have these reactions to them, whatever they may be.
And I also found this discussion of, Judaism, is it a race? Is it a religion? So long ago that are still so relevant today. And I'm wondering, when you were touching on that, was it something where for me, it really connected with, it doesn't matter if you're Jewish, we all question our identity and who are we, like whether it's what kind of person are we or a race or religion. And I'm wondering like how you sort of were able to build that so beautifully. I felt like it wasn't, as a Jewish person, I related to it, but I felt that anybody watching it could take that away.
Yeah, I mean that's certainly the goal in all of these things. And often what you find is, the more personal and specific something like that is, the more universal it feels to an audience. And so the idea of this Ashkenazi, the European Jews, and the Mizrahi, the Middle Eastern and North African Jews, the idea of this clash in the culture, is something that people really outside of Israel don't know too much about or don't experience that much. And it's such a big part of the country at that time. It felt like we were handed, a very pure opportunity to engage with it through the story. It's not like we were looking to do it. The real David, the real little boy who's now a much older man, this is his story. His family was in fact from Iraq. In the movie, we have him coming from Libya because the one thing I did want to touch upon was the Mizrahi experience a bit in the Holocaust, which is not talked about very much. And you have Libyan Jews, that are being sent to camps. And that's something that's not very well known. And so we wanted to touch upon that. But beyond that, this is very much his story, in that way, and very much is the way he's coming into this country, and integrating much faster than his family. His father asks him questions in Arabic, he responds in Hebrew. So just by the nature of that reality, it's inherently dramatic. And I find it sort of, an emotional thing that tells us a lot about a historical period without having us to be too didactic about it.
I just found that so fascinating, and I had no idea. And I thought, yeah, it's not, the whole movie is not about that, but even that little tidbit of, you kind of think you've seen it all and know it all. And I was just like, I was fascinated by it and felt like I learned something. I'm wondering whether it has to do with production or writing, what was your biggest frustration with making the film? I like to ask that question because, again, I think, people see this bright, shiny, product and don't often know everything that goes into it.
I mean, we were really blessed on the movie only because we got to do it at all, sort of at the height of the pandemic and under very, very difficult circumstances. And so there was so much support. And I think everybody who's working on the film also recognized sort of how lucky we were to be doing this at the time we were doing it. So, all productions have their, difficulties and disappointments. And so in a way, this was the most difficult, procedurally, maybe one that I've made, but it was also the most rewarding in it. So the hardest part really for something like this is the height of the pandemic and really being away from, my family. I mean, that becomes the hardest. You're very far away for a very long period of time where there's not flexibility, in traveling and these sorts of things. I mean, I think we calculated, it was like I spent 10 weeks or 11 weeks in quarantine over like a 10-month period or something with the way that I had to move around, because we were a bit in Israel for a long period of time, but then we were in Ukraine, doing a bit of it. And so it was just, so that's the part of it in a way that's, the hardest, for lack of a better term. The rest of it, it's probably the time I'm most present-minded is the making of, certainly the filming of the movie itself. So I don't tend to get too bogged down by, all the various problems that can befall things. And the group is also pretty good at coming up with solutions. And so I always think of these things as sort of problems to be solved.
What was the feedback that you got from people who, had been through it?
Through
From
making,
the film? Yeah. No,
through
through
the
like, yeah.
through the making of the movie. Well, I think in particular, Noam, who plays the young boy, he had not been an actor before this movie. And I think for him, in talking to him, it opens up a whole new world, for somebody getting to be involved in something. And when they're so gifted, even though they haven't been an actor before, watching somebody evolve so quickly into such an amazing performer is kind of the best part of doing something like this. So a bit of that's my interpretation of the thing, but he seemed to really come to the manner born, in this acting world, and so maybe something like that.
I mean, he was incredible. And then, are you sort of, when you look at, I don't know if you look at reviews or anything, especially with a subject that's so sensitive and so close to your heart and to so many people's, like, whose critique slash feedback mattered most to you?
Well, when you really feel like you've done everything you can do on a movie like this to make it the way you felt it, and it turns out even remotely close to it, it's 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 a very fulfilling thing. So I really love the movie, and I mean, in the way that I almost feel like I didn't make it. I can watch it at the screenings and enjoy it and still feel things from it. And that's from my experience, very unique and kind of wonderful side effect of it. Yeah, generally I do read the reviews, and even sort of when they hurt, if somebody doesn't like it. I mean, in this case, for the most part, people seem to connect to it. I move past it pretty quickly, and often they're right about things. You read something like, oh, well, I never thought about it quite like that, but interesting, that kind of thing. And then I think the key with that stuff is, you just keep going with these. You just go kind of on to the next sort of thing. And that's a big part of making these movies. I think that, that we don't, it's like in our culture, we don't talk a lot of, enough about death. It's the same thing with maybe the reaction to these movies. A very big part of making movies is the possibility that people won't like them. And so, I mean, that's just sort of built into it. So, I think it's a kind of a natural ebb and flow in terms of that stuff for me.
Yeah, I think it's just such an important film, and so well done. And I'm just wondering what's next for you. Do you sort of have projects lined up? Are you continuing to kind of explore this subject matter in space, or are you like onto some musical theater comedy?
Yeah, the next one's very different. Tom and I have written a new one that it looks like we'll be doing soon, and in English.
Is it about the Holocaust or some?
No, totally, completely unrelated. I mean, and even this one, which has some moments of levity. The next one's probably much more across the board funny.
Looking forward to it. This has been such an honor and delight for me. Again, I loved the movie, and I'm so glad you made it.
Thank you, Dina. I really appreciate it.
See it.
Thanks for doing this.